The term microaggression originated in the early 1970s with the work of Harvard psychiatrist Chester M. Pierce. First applied to describe insults against Black Americans and later against women, it has now become largely accepted as a way for people to talk about a wide range of issues related to discrimination, offense, and exclusion against any marginalized group. Perhaps no one has done more to elaborate on the concept of microaggressions, their occurrence in everyday life, and the damage they can cause than Columbia professor of psychology and education Daryl Wing Su, who has written extensively on the topic. The term itself is well known in certain circles, but still largely unknown to most people. It's most used in the context of higher education, linked to a growing consciousness of students who speak up for injustices they see, including subtle verbal injustices in the classroom and on campus. The reaction against the concept of microaggressions and our response. In recent years, there's been varied strong negative reactions against the term microaggression and a related term, trigger warning. Here we describe 4 common arguments. First, people sometimes think that this is political correctness run amok. They may think that people are being policed for the small things they say, and therefore it is impossible to speak about any challenging issues. You can see this kind of reaction very strongly among conservatives, but even among many liberals and progressives who think that sensitivity to the subtleties of language really is taking the concept of microaggression and injustice too far. One popular New York Magazine article by Jonathan Chait from a few years ago, for example, claimed that microaggressions were part of a larger politically correct stance that people should be expected to treat even faintly unpleasant ideas or behaviors as full-scale offenses. The key idea here is that these critics are taking the micro part of microaggressions to heart, arguing that they're not a big deal compared to the more serious kinds of racism and other isms that we recognize as problems. Explicit segregation and inequality were a big deal and are worth fighting against. But we've come a long way and made progress on those sorts of things. Paying attention to these seemingly little and subtle slights is just distracting and almost insulting to the real racism that existed. At least, that's how the story goes. Second, people may argue that even if the microaggression causes harm, it is everyone's right under free speech to say it anyway. They imagine that people fighting for social justice are literally telling people that they cannot say certain things, which they consider an assault on free speech. Groups such as Speech First have even legally challenged policies, such as the University of Michigan's policy that convenes a group of staff to focus on addressing incidents that may reflect bias against members of the university community based on their identity. This challenge to the policy was supported by the Department of Justice, which released a statement saying the University of Michigan's policy was unconstitutional. Third, some people argue that seeing microaggressions everywhere and feeling that words can do violence actually feeds victim culture and makes people, especially young people, more fragile. This argument is captured in Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt's controversial book, The Coddling of the American Mind. They argue that young people have been coddled, given trophies for participation by helicopter parents who don't think their children can handle disappointment. After years of that shielding, those children now have an inability to cope with negative emotions generated from disappointment or even from ideas that they don't like. Lukianoff and Haidt further argue that young people see any ideas contrary to their own beliefs as a form of violence that needs to be limited or avoided. While the scientific argument about young people, and especially young women, having more anxiety and depression than before in recent history may be sound and alarming, we take issue with the idea that sensitivity to subtle injustices is causing this problem and creating fragile young people. There is empirical evidence that experiencing microaggressions takes a toll on people's emotional well-being and physical health. However, there is no empirical evidence that we could find demonstrating that if people were ignorant of the microaggressions around them, they would be happier.